The cold came in from the north the way it always did in late November, sliding down from the peaks of the San Juan Mountains and settling into the valley like something that intended to stay. By 5 in the morning, the temperature outside May Whitfield's cabin had dropped to 11 degrees, and the road that wound down from her ridge was glazed with a thin sheet of ice that caught the first pale suggestion of dawn and threw it back in broken pieces. May was already awake. She had been awake since 4, the way she had been awake since 4 nearly every morning for the past 30 years. Her body having long since abandoned the idea that sleep was something a person could hold on to past a certain hour. She lay still for a few minutes in the darkness, listening to the silence, the way a person listens for something they expect to hear eventually. Then she rose, pulled on her wool socks and her flannel shirt, and the heavy canvas pants she had worn on these morning walks for longer than she could clearly remember, and she moved into the kitchen to start the percolator. The cabin was small. Earl had built it himself in 1971, cutting every timber from trees he had felled on the property, notching every joint by hand, with the same patience he brought to everything he ever made. The roofline followed the natural slope of the ridge. The windows were placed to catch the morning light from the east and the evening light from the west. The front porch was wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, which was exactly how many Earl had made, and which was exactly how many still sat there, though only one of them moved now. May did not spend much time thinking about that. She poured her coffee into the blue enamel mug that had been hers for 40 years and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the darkness beyond the glass. The pines were invisible against the sky. The road below was a pale stripe between 2 walls of shadow. Nothing moved. The world outside the window looked exactly like a world that had decided to hold its breath and wait. On the counter beside the sink sat a wooden box roughly the size of a shoebox, its lid worn smooth from decades of handling. Inside, a blood pressure cuff, still in working order, suture needles in sealed sterile packets, antiseptic solution, compression bandages, a tourniquet, morphine ampules from a medical supply she had maintained and rotated since 1974, and a pair of scissors with handles worn to the exact shape of her right hand. Most people who visited the cabin assumed it was a sewing kit. May had never felt the need to correct them. On the small bookshelf beside the bedroom door, between a Bible with a cracked spine and a collection of Earl's woodworking journals, sat 3 medical textbooks, published in the last 5 years. May read them the way other women her age read novels. She marked passages. She argued with conclusions in the margins. She kept current because it satisfied something in her mind that did not like leaving things unfinished, and because she had learned long ago that knowledge did not expire just because the person carrying it had gotten old. She had been 20 years old in the summer of 1950, fresh out of nursing school in Lexington, Kentucky, when the Army had taken her on as a field nurse and sent her to a place she had never heard of and could not have found on a map without help. She had spent 2 winters near the 38th parallel in a canvas tent that leaked in the rain and froze solid in January, stitching closed wounds that would have made most people faint, dead away, keeping her hands steady by force of will, while the ground shook with artillery and the men around her were afraid. She had come home in 1952 and met Earl at a church social in June, married him in September, and built 60 years of life in the quiet spaces between the things the world asked of them. Earl had been gone for 2 years now. May finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and went to get her walking stick. It stood beside the front door, where it had stood for as long as she had been using it. A length of mountain ash that Earl had stripped and shaped and sanded over the course of a long winter evening, carving a simple knot pattern into the grip that fit her hand, as if it had been measured for it. The wood had darkened over the years from the oil of her palm and the weather and time, and it was smooth in the places she held it and rough in the places she did not. She picked it up and felt the familiar weight of it and put on her coat. Outside, the air hit her face like a hand pressing flat against her skin. She paused on the porch for a moment to let her body adjust, looking out at the road below, and the dark shapes of the pines, and the thin strip of slightly lighter sky along the eastern ridge, where dawn was beginning its slow consideration of whether to show up. Then she stepped down off the porch and started walking. The road was 3 miles from end to end if you walked the full loop down from the ridge and along the valley floor and back up the long switchback on the south side. May had walked it more times than she could count. She knew every pothole and every frost heave and every place where the shoulder dropped away too sharply in the dark. She walked it because Earl had walked it with her for 20 years before his knees gave out, and because her own doctor had told her 2 years ago that her heart needed the exercise, and because the truth was that the walking was the only time of day when the cabin did not feel so much like a place where someone used to live. She was a mile down the road when she smelled the gasoline. She stopped walking. The smell was faint but unmistakable, the sharp petroleum bite of fuel that had been spilled and was now cooling on frozen asphalt. She stood still and breathed in, slowly turning her head slightly, the way she had learned to do in Korea, when a smell meant something she needed to identify before she moved toward it. Then she saw the skid marks. They began 50 yards ahead of her, 2 dark lines carved across the pale surface of the road in a wide arc that ended at the guardrail on the right side. The guardrail had a new dent in it. Beyond the guardrail, down a shallow embankment that dropped maybe 8 feet to a flat shelf of frozen ground, she could see the chrome catching what little light the dawn was offering. 2 motorcycles, both on their sides, both still. May moved to the edge of the road and looked down. The larger of the 2 men was lying on his back against the base of a pine tree. His legs bent at an angle that suggested the impact had thrown him before the cold had taken him. He was wearing a leather jacket with something printed across the back in large letters, a design she could not fully read from where she stood, and his face was turned up toward the sky. Even from the road 10 feet above and 30 feet away, she could see that his skin had taken on a color it should not have had. The second man was smaller and younger, and was lying face down in the frozen grass beside one of the motorcycles, one arm thrown out to the side. His helmet cracked along the left side where it had met something harder than itself. He was not moving at all. May did not hesitate. She did not stop to calculate the odds, or consult her feelings, or wonder whether this was any of her business. She had been past all of that for 60 years. She picked her way carefully down the embankment, using her stick to test the ground. Before each step, keeping her weight centered and her knees slightly bent, the way a person learns to move on uncertain ground when they have had enough opportunities to learn it. She reached the younger man first and crouched beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His skin was cold enough that she could feel the wrongness of it even through the numbness in her own fingertips. She held very still. There was a pulse, slow and weak and far away, like something heard through a wall but present. She shifted her position and watched his back for the rise and fall of breath. After a moment, she saw it. Shallow, irregular, but there. She stood and moved to the larger man. His eyes were closed, and his face was the pale blue of a person whose core temperature had dropped far enough to begin shutting things down in order of priority. His breathing was audible from 2 feet away, a slow, rattling pull of air that told her his airway was clear, but that his body was working very hard to do something it was becoming less and less capable of doing. She checked his pulse at his neck. Stronger than the younger one, but not strong. His fingers, where they curled at his sides, had no color left in them at all. He had been here for a long time, hours almost certainly. The ice on the road above them had formed after they went down. May stood up straight, leaned on her stick, and looked at both men in the growing light of the early dawn. She did a rapid calculation in her mind, the same kind she had done in a canvas tent in Korea, while artillery shook the ground. What do I have? What do I need? And in what order do things need to happen? She needed the toboggan. Earl had built it in 1978 for hauling firewood from the woodpile to the cabin in winter. A long, flat sled of hardwood planks with steel runners and a rope pull hung in the shed behind the cabin. For the 340-some days a year, it was not needed. It was built for hauling split oak and maple, and it was overbuilt the way Earl overbuilt everything solid and heavy and designed to last longer than the person who made it. May climbed back up the embankment and walked back to the cabin in the gray light, moving as quickly as she safely could, which was faster than most people her age moved when they were not in a hurry. She got the toboggan from the shed, loaded it with every blanket she had, the wooden box of medical supplies, and the 2 hot water bottles she filled from the kettle she set to boil the moment she came through the door. She added a second kettle. She thought about the 2 men lying in the cold on the other side of that mile of frozen road, and she went back out the door without sitting down. She made the trip to the embankment and back twice. The first trip she brought the younger man, Remy, whose name she did not yet know, wrapping him in blankets and securing him to the toboggan with the rope in a way that kept his airway clear and his head elevated slightly. Then pulling him up the embankment, one careful foot at a time, setting her stick into the frozen ground and leaning into the weight of him until she crested the top and got onto the road. She pulled him home through the cold and got him through the door and onto the living room floor beside the wood stove, which she had stoked to maximum before she left. And she covered him with heated blankets she had been turning in the oven since she returned for the toboggan. Then she went back. The larger man, Cole, whose name she also did not yet know, was more difficult. He had regained partial consciousness by the time she came back for him, which made him more dangerous to move and not less, because he wanted to help and could not coordinate his body well enough to do so without risking further injury. She spoke to him steadily and quietly the whole time she worked, not explaining everything. Just the next step, then the next one after that. He listened the way very disciplined men listen when they have enough sense left to know they are not in charge of the situation. She got him onto the toboggan. She got him up the embankment. She pulled him home. By the time she had both men in the cabin, the eastern sky had gone from gray to pale gold, and the temperature outside had dropped another 2 degrees. May worked for the next 3 hours without stopping. She understood hypothermia the way a mechanic understands an engine, not from reading about it, but from having dealt with it in conditions where getting it wrong meant watching a person die in front of her. The body in severe cold does not simply get cold the way a room gets cold. It gets cold the way a system fails in order by priority. The least essential things going first. The most essential things last. The key to treating it was not speed, but sequence, warming the core first. The periphery, second, never shocking a system that was already in crisis. Never letting the appearance of progress substitute for the reality of it. She rotated heated blankets every 12 minutes. She placed hot water bottles at the neck, the armpits, and the groin, the body's major vascular crossroads, and replaced them when they cooled. She kept the wood stove at its maximum output and cracked the window on the south wall by 1/2 inch to prevent the room from becoming dangerously dry. She monitored breathing and pulse rates at regular intervals and noted the times in the small spiral notebook she kept on the kitchen counter for exactly this kind of record. The younger man remained unconscious but stable. His color was improving. His breathing had evened out. The larger man came back in stages. First, there was movement in his hands, a slow, involuntary clenching and unclenching that told her his circulation was returning to his extremities. Then there was a change in his breathing, deeper and more regular. Then his eyes opened, not all the way at first, just enough to take in the ceiling above him and the stove to his left, and the old woman kneeling beside him with her fingers pressed to the inside of his wrist. He tried to sit up. May put one hand flat against his sternum and pressed down with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. She told him plainly he had hypothermia and possible internal injuries, and if he moved suddenly, he was going to make things considerably worse. She told him she was going to continue what she was doing and he was going to lie still and let her do it, and that the young man across the room was alive and breathing and being taken care of. He lay back down. He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. His lips moved. She watched his face while she worked, reading it, the way she had learned to read the faces of men who were trying to decide how much of what they were feeling they were allowed to show. He said, "Is he going to be okay?" May looked across the room at Remy Pruitt, whose color had returned to something close to normal, and whose breathing was as regular as a sleeping child. She said, "I believe so, but I need you to stop talking and let your body do what it is trying to do." He said nothing after that for almost an hour. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger still, rough at the edges, but no longer the voice of a man whose body was running on reserves it did not have. He said his name was Cole Greer, and the man across the room was Remy Pruitt, and they had been coming down from a chapter meeting in Durango when the back tire of his bike caught a patch of black ice on the curve 2 miles up the road, and they had gone down hard and fast, and he had tried to get to Remy, but he couldn't feel his hands, and then he could not feel anything. May asked him how long he thought they had been down there before she found them. He said he did not know. He said he had lost track of time very early. May said, "Based on your core temperature when I found you, I would estimate between 4 and 6 hours." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Lady, I do not know who you are or what you are doing way up here alone, but you just did something that I do not have words for." May said, "My name is May Whitfield. I live here. I was a field nurse in the Korean War. What you are experiencing right now is a standard recovery from moderate to severe hypothermia. You will feel significantly better in approximately 2 more hours, and you will feel nearly normal by this evening, though you will be tired for several days. The young man across the room will likely sleep through most of today. This is appropriate. Cole Greer looked at her. She had the sense, not for the first time in her life, that she was being seen by someone who had not expected to see what they were looking at. He said, Korea. She said, 1950 to 1952. He was quiet again. She was checking Remy's pulse for the 7th time that morning when Cole spoke again. He said, "You were not afraid of us." May did not look up from what she was doing. She said no. He said, "Most people are." May thought about how to answer that. She thought about the tent near Heartbreak Ridge in the winter of 1951, about the man she had stitched closed on the left side of her treatment table, while another man was being stitched closed on her right, about the other nurses who would not touch the man on the left because of the uniform he wore, about the cold and the noise and the smell of antiseptic and blood, and the very clear and simple truth that had presented itself to her in that moment and never left, that a wound did not know what country it was from. She sat back on her heels and looked at Cole Greer. She said, "I once treated a Chinese soldier in the same tent on the same night as 2 American boys. My colleagues refused. The tent commander told me I was a disgrace to the uniform. I stitched that man closed, and I kept him alive. And I have never once in my life wondered whether I made the right decision." Cole Greer did not say anything. May said, "Need does not wear a uniform, son. It never has." Something shifted in his face then. Something below the surface, like a change in the quality of the light in a room when a cloud moves. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Remy across the room, and then he looked back at her. And what was in his eyes was not gratitude, not exactly. It was something older than gratitude and less complicated. It was the look of a man who has just understood that he is in the presence of someone who cannot be deceived about what matters. He did not say anything more about it. Agnes Kopp lived 3/4 of a mile down the road from May Whitfield and had lived there for 27 years. And in that time, she had developed a thorough and detailed opinion about nearly everything that happened within view of her kitchen window. She was not a malicious woman. She was a frightened one, which in her case produced many of the same results. She had seen the motorcycles on her way to collect her mail at 6 that morning, lying in the ditch off the guardrail with their chrome catching the early light, and their fuel still leaving a dark stain on the frozen ground. She had seen the marks on May Whitfield's road that told a careful observer something heavy had been dragged up from that ditch and in the direction of the cabin. By 7:30, she was on the phone with the Huerfano County Sheriff's Department. She did not know exactly what she was afraid of. She knew that large men on motorcycles with symbols on their jackets made her afraid, and that she trusted that fear, even when she could not fully explain it, and that making the call felt like the right thing to do. Sheriff Burl Caffey had been with the department for 22 years and had the face of a man who had heard most things at least twice and had learned not to let any of them show on his features before he had a chance to think about them. He was 55 years old and built like a man who had once been very strong and was still stronger than he looked. He drove up the road to May Whitfield's property at 8:15 with his deputy, a younger man named Garrett, following in a second vehicle. He parked at the end of May's drive and sat for a moment looking at the cabin before he got out. He had known May Whitfield for 12 years since he had taken over the county post and started making the rounds of the more isolated properties on his route. He had a respect for her that he would not have been entirely comfortable articulating out loud, the kind of respect that comes from watching someone live with a quiet consistency that you recognize as the real thing, even if you cannot say exactly what makes it real. He also knew that May Whitfield did not ask for his opinion or anyone else's, and had not in all the time he had known her given him any particular reason to offer it. He got out of the truck and walked to the porch. May was standing on it. She was wearing her canvas pants and her flannel shirt and her wool coat, and she was holding her walking stick in her right hand, and she was looking at him with the expression of a woman who had been expecting him and had decided in advance what she was and was not going to say. Caffey stopped at the base of the porch steps. He said, "Morning, May." She said, "Morning, Burl." He said Agnes Kopp called in about some motorcycles off the guardrail down the road. May said 2 men went down on the ice last night. I found them this morning on my walk. They were suffering from severe hypothermia. I brought them back and I have been treating them. They are stable. Caffey looked at her steadily. He said, "I am going to need to see them, May." She said, "They are resting. You are welcome to come back this afternoon when they have had time to recover." Garrett, the younger deputy, had come up to stand beside Caffey and was looking at the cabin with an expression of considerable uncertainty. Caffey did not look at him. He said to May, "These men are members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club." May said, "Yes. I noticed the jackets." Caffey said, May. May said, "Burl. I have been providing emergency medical care to people who needed it since 1950. The affiliation of the person requiring treatment has never been a factor in that decision, and is not going to become one today." Caffey looked at her for a long moment. He was quiet long enough that Garrett started to say something, and Caffey raised one hand slightly, and Garrett stopped. Then Caffey said, "All right. I will come back this afternoon. You call me if anything changes." May said, "I will." He said, "You have my number." She said, "I have had your number for 11 years, Burl." He nodded once and walked back to his truck. Garrett followed him, looking back once at the cabin, with his expression still in some state of unresolved uncertainty. May watched them drive away. Then she went back inside. By noon, Remy Pruitt's eyes were open. He came awake the way very careful people come awake in unfamiliar places, with a rapid survey of everything around him. Before he moved or spoke, his eyes going from the ceiling to the walls, to the stove, to May at the kitchen table, and then across the room to Cole, who was sitting up now against the sofa, with a mug of broth in both hands. Cole said, "Easy, brother. We are safe." Remy's eyes went back to May. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to classify correctly. Then he looked at the bandages on his hands, and the blankets and the warm room and the smell of the broth, and he lay back and said nothing for a while. After a time, he asked where they were. Cole told him. He told him about the crash and about May finding them and about the toboggan in the snow. Remy listened with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to gather information quickly, because situations can change without warning. When Cole finished, Remy looked at May again. He said, "You pulled us both up that embankment by yourself." May said Earl built a good toboggan. Remy shook his head slowly, as if the statement did not quite cover what he was trying to understand. He said, "Nobody does that. Nobody just stops." May looked at him. She said, "I stopped." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached to the floor beside him where his jacket had been folded and laid within reach, and he pulled out a small sketchbook from an inside pocket worn at the corners and swollen slightly from the cold, and a pencil that was mostly stub. He turned to a blank page and began to draw, and after that he did not say much more. But he drew steadily for the rest of the afternoon. The sound of the motorcycles reached the cabin before the light did. It was late afternoon, the sky already going the deep orange of a Colorado winter sunset. Behind the western peaks, when May heard the engines coming up the road from the valley, not one or two, many, moving slowly, and with the deliberate rhythm of men who are traveling together and maintaining formation. Cole heard it first. His head came up from where he had been half dozing on the sofa, and his whole body changed in a way that was not quite tension and not quite readiness, but was something in between. He looked at the window. He said quietly, "That is the chapter." May set down the medical journal she had been reading at the kitchen table and stood up. She said, "Your president," Cole said, "Walt Dugan, goes by Ironside. He is not going to be pleased." May said, "About what specifically?" Cole looked at her. He said, "About this. About us being here. About accepting help from someone outside the club. There are protocols, May. Things that look bad, things that look like weakness. Ironside has kept this chapter together for 20 years by maintaining a very specific set of rules about how we conduct ourselves." May said, "Does he know what happened to you last night?" Cole said, "He knows we did not come home from Durango." May said, "Then he came looking for you." She went to the window and looked out. 8 motorcycles were pulling into the road below the cabin, their headlights sweeping the pines as they made the turn and came up the drive. They were big men on big machines, and they moved with the unhurried certainty of people who expected the world to adjust itself to their presence, which in May Whitfield's considerable experience was a quality shared equally by the very powerful and the very frightened. She put on her coat and picked up her walking stick and went outside. The man who got off the lead motorcycle was not the largest of the 8, but he was the one the others watched. He was somewhere past 60, built wide across the shoulders and heavy through the chest, with a gray beard that came down to the second button of his jacket, and eyes that moved constantly cataloging everything in his field of vision, with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. His jacket bore the same design as Cole's, the same back patch, the same front insignia. His name tag said Ironside in block letters. He stopped at the base of May's porch steps and looked up at her. He said, "You the woman taking care of my boys." May said, "I am May Whitfield. Your men were suffering from severe hypothermia when I found them this morning. They are both stable and recovering." Ironside looked at her. He looked at the cabin behind her. He looked at the walking stick in her hand. He said, "I'm going to need to see them." May said, "You may come in. Your men can wait where they are." A sound behind her told her that Cole had come to the doorway. She did not turn around. Ironside's eyes moved to Cole and something in his face shifted slightly. The way the face of a man shifts when he sees something he was worried about and finds it in better condition than he feared. He said to Cole, "You look like you survived something stupid." Cole said, "Yes, sir." Ironside looked back at May. He said, "Ma, I appreciate what you did. I want you to know that. But these are my people, and I need to understand the situation I am walking into." May said, "The situation is that 2 men nearly died of hypothermia last night and are recovering in my living room. That is the complete situation. There is no other situation." Ironside studied her face. He said, "You live up here alone." She said, "I do." He said, "And you are not afraid of us." May said, "I spent 2 years in a canvas tent near the 38th parallel, patching up men who were trying very hard to die before I could stop them. Fear has never been a particularly useful tool in my experience." Something crossed Ironside's face then. A brief movement, involuntary, there and gone. He said slowly, "Korea." May said 1950 to 1952. He said nothing. May looked at him. Something in his stillness told her she had arrived at something she needed to pay attention to. She said, "Were you in the service?" He said, "Army. 1981 to 1987. Cold War era. My brother did 2 tours in different circumstances." May said, "Your brother." She stopped. She was looking at him more carefully now, at his face, at the set of his jaw, at the specific quality of whatever it was that had happened to his expression when she said Korea. She said, "How old is your brother?" Ironside said he would be 58 this March. May said would be. Ironside said he passed 4 years ago, heart. Something was resolving itself in May's memory, slow and certain the way a photograph develops in a dark room, the shapes becoming clear from the chemical fog. She said, "Wait here." She went inside. She went to the bedroom. She went to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, where Earl had kept his important papers and where she had continued to keep things that needed to be kept. And she opened it and went through the contents with steady hands until she found what she was looking for. It was a small cardboard box, the kind that index cards come in filled with photographs, from a span of years she had not looked at in some time. She went through them until she found the one she was looking for. It was from the summer of 1987. She had been running a volunteer first aid station out of the back of a panel truck, 3 days a week driving the mountain roads in the county and stopping at places where people might need help and might not be able to reach it through normal channels. She had done this for 7 years, from 1980 to 1987, until her knees made the climbing in and out of the truck too painful to continue. She had printed cards that summer, small white cards with her name and a phone number and the words, "If you need help and cannot get to help, call." She had left stacks of them at gas stations and general stores and roadhouses and anywhere else people who lived off the grid might think to look for something like that. She brought the photograph out onto the porch. In the photograph, May was standing beside the panel truck on a dirt road somewhere in the county, and beside her was a young man sitting on the tailgate with his left leg extended and wrapped in the compression bandage May had just put on it after pulling him out of the ditch where his motorcycle had gone down at speed, and his leg had been caught under the machine for long enough to create the kind of damage that, left untreated, would have ended his ability to walk on it properly for the rest of his life. The young man in the photograph was 24 years old, lean and dark-haired and wearing a jacket with a design May had seen before. and he was looking at the camera with the expression of someone who had just understood that they were gonna be all right. May held the photograph out to Ironside. He took it. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his face was not what it had been. She said I could not remember his name for certain, but I remember the leg and I remember the road, and I remember that he had a brother. He talked about the whole time I was working on him. He said his brother was the one who had always looked out for him, and he was afraid his brother was gonna find out what had happened and be angry at him for not being more careful. Ironside did not say anything. May said I gave him a stack of those cards before I left and told him to hand them out to anyone who might need them. Ironside reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and brought out his wallet. It was thick and worn chrome plated with engravings on the surface that May recognized as names. The names of people someone wanted to remember. He opened it and went through the contents, and then he brought out a card and held it. It was one of May's cards from 1987. White water stained worn at the corners until it was nearly round. The ink faded to the point where the words were barely readable. He had been carrying it for 37 years. May looked at the card. She looked at Ironside. He said nothing. She said nothing. The 8 men behind him on their motorcycles were perfectly still. Cole Greer, standing in the doorway of the cabin, was perfectly still. Remy Pruitt, visible through the window, had stopped drawing. Walt Ironside Dugan, who had run the Pinecrest chapter of the Hells Angels for 23 years, who had never in the time any of his men had known him, given ground to anything or anyone who had built his authority on the absolute consistency of a set of principles from which he did not deviate under any circumstances, looked at the woman on the porch above him with the card from 1987 in his hand. And he bowed his head. It was a brief gesture. Small contained the movement of a man who has not made it often and is not entirely sure of the mechanics of it. But it was unmistakable, and every man behind him saw it. May looked at him steadily. She said, "Your men can come inside and have coffee. It is too cold to sit on motorcycles." Ironside looked up. He said, "Ma'am." May said, "Do not ma'am me. Come inside." She turned and went back into the cabin, and the door was open behind her. And after a moment, Walt Ironside Dugan walked up the porch steps and followed her in, and one by one the men behind him dismounted and came in after him, filling the small cabin with leather and cold air, and the particular silence of men who have just seen something they did not expect and are still deciding what to do with it. May put the kettle on and got out the cups. Outside, the sun went down behind the San Juan Mountains, and the temperature dropped towards 0. And the road below the cabin sat empty and glazed with ice under the first stars of the night, a pale ribbon through the dark, running in both directions toward things that had not yet happened. 3 months passed the way mountain winters pass, not quickly, but with a kind of relentless forward motion that makes the distance visible only when you turn around and look at where you were. By February, Cole Greer had replaced 3 boards on May's front porch, repointed the stone chimney, rehung the shed door that had been dragging on its frame since the previous spring, and split enough firewood to last through March and into April, if the season ran long. He worked in the mornings before the temperature dropped below useful methodically, and without being asked, approaching each task the way a man approaches a thing he has decided he owes and intends to pay. Remy Pruitt spent his mornings at the Pinecrest Elementary School, 2 miles down the valley road, where the principal, a woman named Dorothy Hatch, had agreed after considerable hesitation to let him work with the 3rd and 4th grade classes twice a week on drawing and painting. The hesitation had lasted about 45 minutes, which was how long it took for the school district's arts budget to come up in the conversation, and for Dorothy Hatch to weigh her reservations against the reality of 30 children with no formal arts instruction, and a man sitting across from her who could draw a recognizable portrait in the time it took most people to find a pencil. May watched all of this from the kitchen window and from the porch and from the road on her morning walks, and she did not comment on it because commenting on it would have made it a subject for discussion. And she had learned long ago that the most useful things in a person's life are often the ones that happen without anyone pointing at them. The chapter came and went. Not the whole chapter, not 8 men with their engines filling up the quiet, but 2 or 3 at a time, arriving in the late afternoons with injuries that ranged from the minor to the things that would have been serious if they had been left longer. May treated each one with the same economy of motion and expression she brought to everything charged. Nothing asked for nothing and sent them home with whatever they needed, and clear instructions about what to watch for. Walt Ironside Dugan came himself twice in those 3 months. The first time he sat at May's kitchen table and drank 2 cups of coffee and said very little, and she did not push him to say more. And when he left, he shook her hand and said he would be in touch. The second time he brought a bag of groceries he set on the counter without explanation, which she accepted without comment. And they sat for an hour while he asked her questions about the Korean War that were not really questions about the Korean War. She understood what he was actually asking, and she answered that too. The parts that could be answered, and left the parts that could not be answered alone. Cole told her about Grace in the 2nd week of January, not as something he wanted to discuss, but as something he felt she needed to know. The way a person states a fact that has been sitting in the room for a while and finally requires acknowledgement. Grace was 8 years old and lived with her mother Wren in a rented house in the town of Walsenburg, 20 miles down from the mountain. She had been diagnosed at age 5 with a recurring lung condition that responded to treatment, but did not resolve entirely, that required monitoring and medication adjustments that the local pediatric clinic was not consistently equipped to provide. She had been hospitalized twice in the past 3 years. The last hospitalization had been in October, 6 weeks before Cole and Remy went down on the ice. Wren had called Cole from the hospital at 2 in the morning. He had driven straight through from Durango. He had sat in the waiting room for 4 hours before she came out and told him Grace was stable and that he could not see her yet, and that when he could, she would let him know. He had driven home the next morning without seeing his daughter. He said this without particular expression, the way men of his generation and background often say things that have cost them considerably. May listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Tell me about the lung condition specifically." He told her what he knew, which was not everything, but was enough. She asked several questions that he answered as precisely as he could. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "I would like to speak with Wren." Cole looked at her. He said, "May." She said, "I am not asking you to arrange it. I am telling you what I intend to do." He said, "She does not know you." May said no, but she knows that Grace needs a level of medical oversight she is not currently getting, and that is a conversation I am qualified to have with her. Cole was quiet. He said she has her reasons for keeping distance between Grace and my life. May said, I know she does, and I am not going to ask her to change them. I'm going to talk to her about her daughter's lungs. That is a different conversation. Cole did not say yes, and he did not say no, and the following Tuesday, May put on her good coat and drove her truck down the mountain road toward Walsenburg. She brought her medical kit and a photograph of Earl. Wren Greer opened the door of the rented house on 7th Street and looked at May Whitfield on her porch with an expression that contained several things at once, none of them quite alarm and none of them quite welcome. May said her name and said she was a neighbor of Cole's and a retired field nurse, and that she was not there about Cole. She was there about Grace, and that she would only need a few minutes if Wren preferred to keep it short. Wren opened the door. The house was small and kept with the particular neatness of a woman raising a child alone on a careful budget. There were drawings on the refrigerator, stacked books on the coffee table, a child's sneakers by the front door. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a television. They sat at the kitchen table. May did not lead with Cole. She led with the specific medical details she had asked Cole about the pattern of recurrence, the medication history, the monitoring protocol the clinic in Walsenburg had been using, which was adequate but not optimal for the presentation Cole had described. Wren listened with her arms crossed and her expression careful, the way a woman listens when she is deciding how much to trust what she's hearing. After a few minutes, she began asking questions. They were good questions, precise questions. The questions of someone who had done her own research and was testing the information in front of her against what she already knew. May answered each one directly and without simplifying. After a while, Wren uncrossed her arms. She said, Cole told you about all this. May said he told me what he knew, which was not complete, but it was enough to understand that Grace needs more consistent oversight than she is getting. Wren said, I've been trying to get a referral to the pulmonary specialist in Pueblo for 6 months. The clinic keeps telling me her case does not meet the threshold. May said I would like to look at her records if you are willing to let me. I may be able to help make the case for the referral in terms the clinic is more likely to act on. Wren looked at her. She said, you are a retired field nurse from the Korean War. May said, I am. I am also someone who has been staying current in medical literature for 60 years because it interested me and because I believed it might be useful at some point. I cannot write prescriptions and I am not licensed to practice medicine. But I know how to read a pulmonary case file, and I know the language that gets a referral approved. A silence. Wren looked at the kitchen window. Her profile in that moment was the profile of a woman carrying more than one thing and doing it without complaint and getting tired of the wait. May said, I would like to show you something. She opened her coat and took out the photograph of Earl. She set it on the table between them. It was a photograph from 1962. Earl in his workshop, sawdust on his arms, holding up a finished cabinet door with the expression of a man who has just confirmed that a thing he made is the thing he intended to make. He looked solid and certain, and very much like himself. Wren looked at the photograph, and then at May. May said his name was Earl. We were married for 60 years. He was a man who made people uneasy when they first met him, because he was large and quiet and did not explain himself often. Most people in the county did not know what to make of him for the first year or two. I almost did not give him a chance the first time we met. Ren was quiet. May said, I am not asking you to change anything about how you have structured your life or what you have decided is good for Grace. I am asking you to let me look at a set of medical records so that an 8-year-old girl gets the specialist appointment she has been waiting 6 months for. She left the photograph on the table. Grace's records were in a manila folder in the second drawer of the kitchen desk. Ren put them on the table and May went through them methodically, reading without rushing, making notes in the small spiral notebook she carried in her coat pocket. When she finished, she wrote for 3 minutes without stopping and then tore the page out and handed it to Ren. She said, this is a summary of the clinical indicators in Grace's record that meet the threshold criteria for a specialist referral under the Medicaid Pediatric Pulmonary Guidelines. The clinic has been evaluating her against the general threshold. The correct threshold for her presentation is the Pediatric Chronic Recurrence Standard, which is different. Present this language to the clinic administrator, not the attending physician. Use the words I have written there. Exactly. Ren read the page. She read it again. She said, how do you know all of this? May said, I read. The referral appointment in Pueblo was scheduled 17 days later. May learned about Commissioner Boyd Strickland the way most people in rural Colorado learned about politicians they had not been paying attention to, gradually and then all at once. His name began appearing in the local paper in late January in the context of a bid for the state Senate seat that had opened up when the incumbent announced his retirement. He was 58 years old and had served 2 terms as county commissioner, during which time he had made a point of being visible and vocal on issues of public safety and community standards, which in practice meant he attended a lot of ribbon cuttings and made a lot of statements about the kinds of things that threatened the quality of life in rural Colorado communities. He had a good face for local television. Square-jawed, neatly barbered, the kind of face that reads as trustworthy from a distance, without offering much to examine up close. May paid no particular attention to him until the 3rd week of February, when Agnes Kopp stopped her on the road during her morning walk and told her that she had heard Commissioner Strickland was planning to visit Pinecrest as part of his campaign tour, and that he had made some remarks at a recent fundraiser that Agnes felt May should know about. May stopped walking and asked what remarks. Agnes, who had the particular discomfort of someone delivering information she knows will not be well received, said that Strickland had mentioned in the context of a discussion about community safety standards that there were situations in the county where civilians had developed inappropriate relationships with outlaw motorcycle clubs, and that these relationships created liability and risk for the surrounding community, and that, as state senator, he would support measures to address this kind of situation. May said, he said civilians. Agnes said that is the word he used. May said, and he said, inappropriate relationships. Agnes said yes. May looked at her. She said, did he mention any names? Agnes was quiet. May said, Agnes. Agnes said there was a photograph in the presentation he was using. It was taken from the road through the trees. It showed your cabin and 2 motorcycles parked in the drive. Someone must have taken it recently because the snow on the roof was from this season. May stood on the road in the cold and considered this information with the same quality of attention she brought to a set of medical records or a changing weather system or anything else that required accurate assessment before response. She said, thank you for telling me. Agnes said, May, I know. I have not always been. May said, Agnes. Thank you for telling me. She continued her walk. 3 days later, the story appeared in the Pueblo Chieftain. Not the local paper, but the regional one, the one with actual circulation. The story was about Commissioner Strickland's campaign platform and his commitment to rural community safety. And embedded in the third paragraph was a reference to a specific situation in Huerfano County, where the story said a local resident had been providing what it described as aid and shelter to members of a known outlaw motorcycle organization, raising questions about the safety of neighboring properties and the appropriate boundaries of civilian engagement with criminal organizations. The story did not name May directly. It did not need to. By the end of that week, 2 things had happened. The first was that a law firm from Colorado Springs with no prior connection to anyone in Huerfano County sent a certified letter to May Whitfield's address, informing her that she was the subject of a formal complaint filed with the county regarding the operation of an unlicensed medical facility at a residential property and requesting her presence at a hearing before the county board the following month. The second was that Agnes Kopp gave an interview to a television crew from the Pueblo station that ran the following evening on the 6:00 news, in which Agnes, standing in front of her own mailbox in her good coat, described her concerns about the safety of her neighborhood and the frequency of motorcycle traffic on the mountain road, and the worry she felt for the well-being of an elderly neighbor who she believed was being taken advantage of. May watched the interview in the evening sitting in Earl's chair, and she watched it with the complete attention she gave to things that required understanding before response. And when it was over, she sat for a while in the quiet of the cabin and thought about Agnes Kopp, who was not a malicious woman, and who was afraid of things she could not fully articulate, and about Boyd Strickland, who was neither of those things and was doing this for reasons May did not yet fully understand. That was the part that bothered her. A politician running for office attacking a local situation for visibility was understandable. The level of specific attention Strickland had directed at a single cabin on a mountain road in Huerfano County was not, from a purely strategic standpoint, proportionate. She got up from Earl's chair and went to the cedar chest. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was doing what she often did when something needed sorting, going through the accumulated record of a life and letting the material tell her what was there. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed contained, in rough chronological order, Earl's military discharge papers from 1946, their marriage certificate from 1953, the deed to the property insurance documents, correspondence from the 1950s and 1960s in rubber-banded bundles, photographs, Earl's woodworking journals from 1965 onward, and a collection of miscellaneous papers in a cardboard accordion folder that she had not gone through thoroughly since Earl's death. She went through the accordion folder. Most of it was what she expected: receipts, warranties for appliances long since replaced, notes in Earl's careful block lettering about projects completed and materials used. Near the back of the folder, in a section that appeared to contain correspondence Earl had kept but not filed systematically, she found a letter. It was in an envelope addressed to Earl Whitfield in handwriting she did not recognize, postmarked September 1962, from an address in Walsenburg. The envelope had been opened and the letter replaced inside it, and the flap folded back down, but not resealed the way Earl handled correspondence he intended to return to. She took the letter out. It was 2 pages handwritten, dated September 14th, 1962. The signature at the bottom was Harlan Strickland. May had never heard of Harlan Strickland. She read the letter. It took her 3 readings before she understood completely what she was looking at. Because the letter was written in the way that people of a certain era and a certain pride write letters about things that have injured them, with the injury contained and displaced into language that is formal and controlled and only barely adequate to the weight of what is underneath it. The substance of the letter was this: Harlan Strickland had contracted with Earl Whitfield in the spring of 1962 to build a house on a piece of land outside Walsenburg. The contract had been signed and a deposit paid. Earl had begun reviewing the materials and specifications. And then Earl had walked away from the contract, returned the deposit in full, and declined to provide an explanation beyond a brief note saying that he was unable to complete the work. Harlan Strickland's letter was demanding that explanation. It was the letter of a man who had built his plans around a commitment that had been withdrawn, and who had been unable to find another contractor in time, and whose construction timeline had collapsed as a result. With consequences he described in the controlled language of someone trying very hard not to say the words that were actually in his mind. May set the letter down on the kitchen table. She went to Earl's woodworking journals and found the volume from 1962. Earl had kept detailed records of every project, materials, dimensions, timeline cost. She found the entry for the Strickland house in April of that year. 3 pages of preliminary notes and material calculations in Earl's block lettering. And then, 3 weeks later, a single line in different ink written more quickly than the surrounding entry. The line read, "Materials sourced by Harlan Strickland from Benton Supply. Billing records show consistent short weighting on lumber grade. Concrete mix substandard by visible inspection. Structure built on this foundation will not stand 20 years. Cannot put my name on it. Contract returned." Below that in the same quick ink, "HS will not thank me for this." May sat at the kitchen table with Earl's journal open in front of her, and Harlan Strickland's letter beside it. And she was quiet for a long time. Harlan Strickland had been building a house on a fraudulent materials contract, either knowingly or not. And Earl had discovered it during his preliminary review, and had refused to continue, and had returned the deposit, and had not explained why. Because explaining why would have required him to accuse Harlan Strickland of fraud, which he had no interest in doing, and because Earl was a man who believed that removing yourself from a dishonest situation was sufficient, and that further engagement with it usually made things worse. The Strickland construction had collapsed. Whatever plans Harlan Strickland had built around that house had not been built. May did not know the full scope of what had followed, but she could read the tone of the 1962 letter and understand that the damage had been significant. Boyd Strickland would have been 12 years old in 1962, old enough to understand that something had happened to his father's plans, old enough to hear the name Earl Whitfield said with a particular quality of feeling, old enough for that to leave a mark that did not go away. May looked at the letter and the journal entry for a long time. Then she said quietly to the room, "You made a good enemy, Earl." She said it without bitterness. She said it the way you say something about a person you knew completely and still understand completely, and find at the end of a long consideration that you agree with. Earl had done the right thing. The fact that the right thing had produced a consequence that was now arriving at her door 62 years later was not a fact that changed what the right thing had been. She put the letter and the journal on the kitchen table and went to bed. Cole arrived the next morning to work on the woodpile and found her at the kitchen table with the letter and the journal in front of her, and the look on her face that he had learned in 3 months meant she had worked something through and was now on the other side of it. She told him what she had found. She told him all of it clearly and without editorial comment, and when she was finished, she answered the 2 questions he asked and waited while he sat with it. He said, "So this has nothing to do with the club." It has never had anything to do with the club. May said the club gave him a useful public framing. The motivation is 60 years old. Cole was quiet. He said May. She said no. He said Ironside could. She said, if Ironside does anything to Boyd, Strickland wins. He gets exactly the story he needs. Everything we have built here becomes evidence for the story he wants to tell about what happens when civilians have relationships with motorcycle clubs. No. Cole looked at her. He said, then what? She said, then I prepare for the hearing. He said, you are going to walk into a county board hearing by yourself against a law firm from Colorado Springs and a sitting commissioner who has been planning this for 60 years. May said, I am going to gather my materials and I am going to be ready for the hearing. That is what I am going to do. She said it without raising her voice in the tone she used for things she had decided and was not going to revisit. Cole looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at the letter and the journal. He said, is there anything you need me to do? She said, yes. I need you to stay out of it until I tell you otherwise. He did not like that answer. But he had spent enough time in this cabin over 3 months to understand that arguing with May Whitfield about a decision she had made was an activity with a very low return on investment. He said, all right. He went outside and split wood. May spent the following 2 days going through the accordion folder more carefully than she had the first time, reading every document, making notes, looking for anything she might need and anything she might have missed. It was on the 2nd day in the late afternoon when the light was going gray, and she had been sitting at the kitchen table for 6 hours and was considering getting up to make coffee that she found the 2nd document. It was not in an envelope. It was a folded single sheet of paper at the very back of the accordion folder, tucked into the crease, as if it had slid there from somewhere else, or been placed there by someone who wanted it kept but not prominent. The paper was thin and had yellowed at the folds, and the typewritten text on it had the slightly uneven character of a machine that needed a new ribbon. It was a letter from the First National Bank of Walsenburg, dated March 3, 1959, confirming the establishment of a charitable trust account in the name of Earl James Whitfield, with an initial deposit of $250. Attached to the bank letter by a rusted paperclip was a handwritten note in Earl's block lettering. It was half a page. It read, account established, March 1959. Purpose to be distributed at trustee discretion to any person or persons in genuine need, without conditions, without record of recipient, without expectation of return. This is not charity. This is a debt. Below that, in a different pen, possibly written at a different time, in January of 1957, my truck went into a drainage ditch off Route 160 east of Alamosa during the blizzard that came through on the 14th. I was there for 6 hours before a group of men on motorcycles came by and pulled me out. They had chains and rope and a truck they were following the bikes with, and they spent 2 hours in that blizzard getting my vehicle back on the road. I offered to pay. They would not take it. I asked for names. They would not give them. I do not know who they were or how to find them. I know what I owe. May sat with the page in her hands. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She thought about Earl in January 1957, in a ditch off Route 160, in a blizzard alone for 6 hours. She would have been in the cabin. She would not have known where he was. She would have been waiting, which was a thing she had become competent at, but never entirely comfortable with. She tried to place the memory, and found something from that winter, a night when he came home very late and very cold, and did not say much about it. And she had given him hot coffee and dry socks, and not asked too many questions because she had understood that he needed to be home before he could talk about whatever had happened out there. He had never told her about the ditch. He had never told her about the men. He had opened a bank account 2 months later and written a note explaining why, and tucked it into the back of an accordion folder and let it sit there for 65 years. May looked at the note for a long time. She looked at it the way you look at something that is both completely surprising and completely in character. The way you look at evidence of a person being exactly who you knew them to be, which is a thing that can make you feel very much alone and very much accompanied at the same time. She got up and made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked out at the woodpile where Cole had been working earlier. The new split logs stacked in even rows against the shed wall, and at the last of the gray light on the pines, and at the road below where the ice had come back with the dropping temperature and was catching the last of the day in small pieces. When the coffee was ready, she poured it into the blue enamel mug and carried it back to the table. She picked up the phone and called the First National Bank of Walsenburg. The account was still active. The original deposit had accrued interest over 65 years in the way that small amounts of money do when they are left entirely alone, and there had been. She was told by a woman in the accounts department who took a few minutes to find the right records, and then a few more minutes to understand what she was looking at. No withdrawals and no changes to the account instructions since its establishment. The current balance was after 65 years of compound interest on a modest initial deposit. With subsequent small additions, Earl had apparently made over the years enough to constitute a legally significant asset. More importantly, the trust was structured correctly. Earl had done it with the help of a local attorney whose name was on the establishment documents, and the structure was clean, and the documentation was in order, and the designated purpose of the trust, the distribution to persons in need without conditions, was exactly as Earl had written it in his note. May thanked the woman and ended the call. She sat with her coffee and thought about what she had. She had a certified letter demanding her presence at a county board hearing on the grounds that she was operating an unlicensed medical facility and maintaining inappropriate associations with a criminal organization. She had a law firm from Colorado Springs and a sitting commissioner with a 62-year grievance and a campaign to run. She had a journal entry in Earl's handwriting documenting the reason he had walked away from a contract in 1962. She had a letter from 1962 from Harlan Strickland that documented in the handwriting of Boyd Strickland's own father that there had been a conflict with Earl Whitfield over that contract. She had a 65-year-old trust account established by her late husband, for the purpose of helping people without conditions funded initially by his desire to repay a debt to a group of motorcyclists who had pulled him out of a ditch in a blizzard. She thought about what Boyd Strickland was trying to do, which was to tell a story about a civilian woman who had been compromised by her association with an outlaw motorcycle club, whose judgment could not be trusted, whose activities on a mountain property needed to be regulated and curtailed. She thought about the story that the documents on her kitchen table told. The story was different. The story was that Earl Whitfield had owed a debt to motorcyclists since 1957 and had been paying it quietly since 1959, and that his wife had been paying a version of the same debt since the morning she found two men dying on a frozen road. The story was that the connection between this cabin on this mountain and the men who rode these roads was older than any of this year's trouble by 65 years, and was rooted not in corruption or compromise, but in the oldest and simplest kind of human transaction. Someone needed help and someone stopped. May looked at the documents on her table. She said quietly to no one, "All right, Earl." Outside, the temperature had dropped to 6 degrees. And the road below the cabin was a pale ribbon of ice under a sky full of stars, and the pines stood very still in the windless cold. Down in Walsenburg, Grace Greer was sleeping in her bed, with her lungs working better than they had in a year, and Wren was in the kitchen with the referral appointment confirmation on the counter where she could see it. Somewhere on the mountain roads, the distant sound of a single motorcycle engine moved through the dark and faded, heading somewhere else, the way things do. May gathered the documents into a careful stack and put a rubber band around them and set them on the kitchen counter where she would be able to find them in the morning. Then she washed her coffee cup, checked the wood stove, and went to bed. She slept well. She had been sleeping well since November. The cabin was the same cabin it had always been. The walls the same wood, the windows the same glass, the roofline following the same slope. Earl had cut it to follow in 1971. But something in the quality of the silence inside it had changed since that morning in November. Something small and difficult to name the way a room changes when it has recently been used for something it was built for without knowing it. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence and thought about the hearing which was coming. She thought about what she was gonna say. She thought about Boyd Strickland sitting in some office somewhere. 60 years of a grievance he had probably never fully examined, running it through the machinery of a political campaign, because it was the most effective mechanism currently available to him for doing the thing he had always wanted to do. She thought about Earl in a ditch in a blizzard in 1957, waiting for someone to stop. She thought about the card that Walt Ironside Dugan had been carrying in his wallet for 37 years. She thought about the way Ironside had bowed his head on her porch in the cold briefly, and then raised it again, and then come inside. She turned on her side and closed her eyes. The San Juan Mountains outside the cabin window were very dark and very still, holding whatever they held, the way mountains do, without comment, without condition. Patient beyond the capacity of any human grievance to outlast. The morning of the hearing, May woke at 4 as she always did, but she did not lie still in the dark the way she usually did. She got up immediately and dressed in the clothes she had laid out the night before. Her good wool slacks, the dark blue blouse Earl had always said made her look like herself, and the heavier of her two good coats, the charcoal one with the deep pockets that could hold the things she needed to carry without making her look like she was carrying them. She made her coffee and stood at the kitchen window and drank it, looking out at the mountain in the dark. The hearing was at 10 o'clock in the county building in Walsenburg. She had 3 hours before she needed to leave. She spent one of those hours at the kitchen table going through the documents one final time, not because she had not already gone through them sufficiently, but because she was the kind of person who prepared for things the way they should be prepared for, which is to say completely, and then prepared once more. The documents were in order. Earl's journal entry from 1962. Harlan Strickland's letter from September of that year. The bank letter establishing the trust in 1959. Earl's handwritten note explaining why. The current account balance documentation from the bank, printed and signed by the accounts department manager. Her own service records from the Army, which she had requested and received from the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, 6 weeks after she returned from Korea, and had kept in the cedar chest ever since. She had also written in the 10 days since she found the documents a 7-page statement of fact, in Earl's style, which meant it was precise and without decoration, and said exactly what needed to be said, and stopped when there was nothing more that needed saying. She had not shown any of this to Cole or to Ironside. She had not shown it to Sheriff Caffey. She had told Cole she was preparing for the hearing, and he had asked twice what he could do. And she had told him twice that she would let him know when there was something, and both times he had accepted this and gone back to whatever he was doing, which was the right response and the one she had expected from him. What she had not told Cole was that she intended to make one stop before the county building. She left the cabin at 7:15. The drive down from the mountain took 25 minutes on the ice, and she drove it the way she drove everything, at the speed appropriate to the conditions, without hurrying and without delay. The valley below was gray with early morning, and the town of Walsenburg was just beginning to show signs of the kind of activity a Tuesday in February produced in a small Colorado town, which was not much but was something. She drove to the county offices building on Main Street, not to the entrance she would use in 3 hours for the hearing, but to the side entrance that led to the administrative wing where the commissioner's offices were located. She had looked up the building directory 2 days ago. She had verified the office number. She parked the truck and got out with her walking stick and the manila folder that contained one item: Harlan Strickland's letter from September 1962. The corridor inside the administrative wing was fluorescent lit and quiet. The kind of institutional quiet that belongs to government buildings before most of their occupants arrive. A woman at the reception desk looked up when May came in, and May told her she was there to see Commissioner Strickland, and that she did not have an appointment, but that the matter was time-sensitive, and she would not need long. The receptionist said the commissioner was in, but that he had a full morning ahead of the hearing. May said she was aware of the hearing, and that was precisely why the timing was what it was. There was a brief phone call. Then the receptionist said the commissioner would see her for a few minutes. Boyd Strickland's office was at the end of the corridor, a corner room with windows on 2 sides that looked out over the parking lot and the street beyond. He was standing when May came in, which was a choice. The way standing when someone enters is always a choice, and it was the choice of a man who wanted to be seen as the person in charge of the room before anything else happened. He was as she had expected from his photographs. Square-jawed, well-dressed for a county commissioner on a Tuesday morning, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was part of the work. He was 58 years old, and he looked it in the specific way of a man who had spent his career in rooms where things were decided, which gives the face a quality of settled authority that can look like confidence and can look like something else, depending on the light. He said good morning and gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk. May did not sit down. She walked to the desk and placed the manila folder on it and opened it and stepped back. He looked at the letter. She watched his face while he looked at it. The quality of a face encountering something it was not expecting is one of the most informative things a person can observe, and May had been observing faces professionally for a long time. What moved across his face was not surprise. It was recognition, which was more telling. He had not expected to see this specific letter in this specific place on this specific morning. But he was not encountering the information for the first time. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. He looked up at her. May said, "I found this in my husband's papers, along with the journal entry where he documented why he walked away from your father's contract, along with the bank records establishing a trust account he opened 2 months after a group of motorcyclists pulled him out of a ditch in a blizzard because he believed he owed a debt, and he intended to pay it. And he did not know their names, and so he paid it the only way he could figure out how." Strickland said nothing. May said, "I am telling you this before the hearing because I believe that a man ought to have the opportunity to end something privately before it ends publicly. What your father went through in 1962 was real, and I do not dismiss it. Earl made a choice that had consequences he was not around to manage, and I understand that those consequences fell on your family. I am not asking you to forgive him. I am asking you to make a decision this morning about whether the next thing that happens in that hearing room is something you chose or something that happened to you." Strickland was quiet for a moment. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I have a responsibility to the constituents of this county who..." May said, "I know what you are going to say. I have read the story you are trying to tell. I am telling you that the documents I am bringing to that hearing room this morning tell a different story. And that different story is true. And that once it is in the public record, it cannot be made untrue. And that the distance between where your campaign is right now and where it will be after that story is in the public record is considerable." She picked up the folder. She said, "I am not threatening you. I am a 78-year-old woman with a walking stick and a folder of old papers. I am telling you the facts of the situation as clearly as I can and giving you time to consider them." Strickland looked at her with an expression she could not quite place, something between calculation and something older than calculation, something that might have been the first stage of a recognition he was not ready to complete. He said nothing. May put on her coat and picked up her walking stick and walked to the door. She did not look back. She walked back down the fluorescent corridor and out through the side entrance and across the parking lot to her truck, and she sat in the driver's seat for a moment and looked at the steering wheel. Then she drove to the diner on Commerce Street and ordered coffee and a piece of toast and sat in a booth by the window and watched the town wake up while she reviewed her statement one final time, reading it the way Earl would have read it, which meant reading for anything that was not exactly precise and correcting it before it went anywhere. At 9:30, she drove to the county building and parked and got out and walked into the main entrance with her walking stick and the folder of documents and her medical kit in a canvas bag over her shoulder. She had brought the medical kit because she had never in her life walked into any situation without it, and she was not going to start now. The hearing room was a rectangular space with a raised dais along one wall, where the board sat, and rows of seats for the public below. By the time May came in at 9:45, most of the seats were occupied. She recognized Agnes Kopp near the back, sitting with two women May knew slightly from the community association. She recognized Sheriff Caffey standing along the side wall in his uniform, and she noted that he was standing in a position from which he could see both the dais and the room, without having to turn his head, which was the position of someone who was watching rather than participating. She recognized Cole Greer and Remy Pruitt, sitting in the third row on the left side, both in clean clothes, neither in their club colors. They had not told her they were coming. She had not told them not to. She recognized Walt Ironside Dugan in the back row on the right side alone, wearing a dark jacket without patches. He looked like a large man trying to take up as little space as possible, which was not something that came naturally to him, and which therefore said something about the effort he was making. And she recognized in the front row on the right side, directly in May's line of sight, as she took her seat at the respondents' table, a woman with dark hair in her 40s, sitting with a small girl in a red coat. Wren Greer. And beside her, Grace. May looked at them. Grace was looking at the room with the wide attentiveness of a child who has been told this is important and is taking that seriously. She had a red coat and dark eyes, and she was sitting up straight, the way children sit up straight when they are trying to demonstrate that they belong somewhere. May had not told Wren about the hearing. She had not asked her to come. She turned to face the dais. The law firm from Colorado Springs had sent two attorneys, a man and a woman, both in their 40s, both carrying the particular quality of organized competence that belongs to people who do this professionally and are not especially interested in the specific content of what they are doing. They had a presentation. They had exhibits. They had a formal complaint document that ran to 11 pages. The board chair, a man named Gerald Foss, whom May had met twice at county events over the years, opened the proceedings with the standard language and then turned to the attorneys and asked them to present. They presented for 25 minutes. They were good at it. The narrative they constructed was coherent and internally consistent. A residential property being used for unlicensed medical procedures, a pattern of engagement with a criminal organization, a pattern of behavior that created liability and risk for neighboring properties and the broader community. They used the word inappropriate 7 times. They used the word concerning 12 times. They had photographs, including the one taken through the trees at May's cabin, and 2 others that May had not seen before, showing men arriving at and departing from the property on motorcycles. They did not say anything that was technically false. They said nothing that was technically true in the way they were presenting it. When they finished, Gerald Foss asked May if she wished to respond. May stood up. She did not have notes in front of her. She had read the statement she had written until she knew it the way she knew the route of her morning walk, every word in its place, everything in order. She said, "My name is May Whitfield. I am 86 years old. I live on a property on the ridge above Pine Crest that my husband Earl built in 1971. I have lived there for 53 years. She said I was trained as a field nurse in 1950 and served in that capacity for 2 years near the 38th parallel in Korea. I treated over 300 patients during that service under conditions that most of you cannot fully imagine and that I do not intend to describe in detail here. I came home in 1952 and I have been keeping my skills current and my supplies adequate ever since. Because it is the kind of person I am, and because Earl always said that a tool maintained is a tool available. She said on the morning of November 17th of last year, I found two men suffering from severe hypothermia beside their crashed motorcycles on the road near my property. I brought them to my cabin and treated them. I did this because they needed treatment, and I was capable of providing it. I did this because in my experience and training, the failure to act when action is possible and necessary is the only genuine error available to a person in a medical emergency. She said, the documents I am submitting to this board today include my military service records, the records of the charitable trust established by my late husband Earl Whitfield in 1959 at the First National Bank of Walsenburg, and two additional documents that I believe are relevant to the board's understanding of the full context of this matter. She submitted the documents. She explained the trust. She read Earl's note aloud in its entirety in Earl's plain block language about the ditch and the blizzard and the men who would not give their names and the debt he intended to pay the only way he could figure out how. She read it without inflection and without pausing for effect, because the words did not need either. They were Earl's words, and they were sufficient. She explained the journal entry from 1962 and the letter from Harlan Strickland, and what the two documents together demonstrated about the history of the Whitfield name in Huerfano County and the specific nature of the grievance that she believed had motivated the complaint now before the board. She did not say Boyd Strickland's name. She did not need to. Gerald Foss knew the name on the complaint. Everyone in the room who had read the local news in the past month knew the name. When she was finished, she sat down. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when a large number of people are all thinking at the same time. Then, from the right side of the front row, a child's voice said something. Gerald Foss looked up. Grace Greer had stood up from her seat beside her mother. She was 8 years old and wearing a red coat, and she was standing in the way that children stand when they have made a decision and are executing it before they have time to change their minds. Wren reached for her arm and then stopped. Grace said she fixed my lungs, and she fixed my dad. She said it clearly without shaking the way a child says a thing they believe to be completely true and have no reason to think requires qualification. Then she sat back down. The hearing took 35 minutes more. The board asked questions. May answered them. The attorneys for the complaint said several additional things that the board listened to with decreasing engagement. Gerald Foss asked his colleagues twice for their assessment and listened to their responses. At 11:22, the board voted. The complaint was dismissed in its entirety. The vote was 4-1. May gathered her documents into the folder and put on her coat and picked up her walking stick and her canvas bag and walked toward the door. People in the seats made way for her. Several of them said things to her words she received with a nod, because she was focused on the door and on the next thing, which was getting outside and getting some air and letting her hands stop doing the thing they had been doing for the past hour and a half, which was staying completely still by effort. Cole was at her elbow before she reached the door. Remy was behind him. She accepted Cole's presence beside her without comment, because she was at this moment glad of it. They came out through the main entrance into the February air. It was cold. 12 degrees and bright, the sky over Walsenburg, that particular shade of winter blue that looks painted on. The courthouse steps were salted, and the parking lot beyond them was gray with packed snow. and the street beyond that was almost empty at this hour on a Tuesday. May stopped at the top of the steps and took a breath of the cold air and let it out. She felt the thing in her chest. At the same moment, she heard Cole say her name. It was not pain, not exactly. It was a disruption, a syncopation in the rhythm she had been carrying in her chest for 86 years, a skip beat, followed by a compensating rush that left her slightly sideways in her own body. The way a room tilts when the floor is not where you expected it. She had felt this before, 4 times in the past 2 years. Each time it had lasted between 30 and 90 seconds, and then resolved. She had taken her medication every morning. She had been managing it. She reached for Cole's arm. He had it before she finished reaching. She did not fall, but she was not entirely standing either. And Cole understood the difference and had his arm around her before the distinction mattered. He was very large and very calm, in the way that men who have been trained for crisis are calm when they are not the one experiencing it. Remy was already on his phone. May said, "It is my heart. It is a rhythm issue. I have had it before, and it is being managed. Call 911 and tell them cardiac arrhythmia, 86-year-old female. No loss of consciousness, no chest pain." Cole said, "I have you." She said, "I know you do. Tell Remy to be precise when he calls." Remy was already being precise. She sat down on the top step, because standing was no longer the best use of available resources, and Cole sat beside her with his arm still around her, and she put her head back slightly and breathed the way she knew to breathe slowly, giving the heart the information it needed about the pace she wanted to return to. The dispatcher on Remy's call said the nearest available unit was 11 minutes out. The mountain road above town had fresh ice from overnight. They would need to assess road conditions before committing to the route to the cabin. May heard this and said nothing about it because there was nothing useful to say. 11 minutes was 11 minutes. She was sitting and she was breathing and Cole was beside her. And the sky above Walsenburg was the specific blue of a Colorado winter. And she had, in the last hour and a half, said everything she had needed to say. She was not afraid. She was, if she was being accurate about it, tired in the way that a person is tired after a long piece of work is finished. A tiredness that is not unpleasant, that has an element of completion in it. Then she heard Walt Ironside Dugan's voice behind her, and above her back toward the building. And she heard him on a phone, and she heard the quality of his voice, which was not the voice of a man in panic, but the voice of a man who has switched into a mode of operation that does not involve any emotion at all, because emotion is not the tool required. She did not hear everything he said. She heard enough. She heard all available. Mountain Road to Walsenburg, right now. Move. Remy was beside her now, and he said, "May, there are going to be some motorcycles." She said, "I know." He said, "A few of them." She said, "How many?" He looked at Ironside, and then back at her. He said, "More than a few." The first engines reached them inside 4 minutes, which meant they had been moving before Ironside finished his call, which meant the call had gone out to the chapter before Ironside made it, which meant someone in that hearing room had been reading the situation and making preparations before the situation required them. May had a sense, not for the first time, of being in the presence of an organization that understood logistics. They came from the direction of the highway first, 3 bikes, then 4 more from the south end of Main Street. Then a group from the direction of the county road that came down from the mountain, all of them pulling into the area in front of the county building and arranging themselves with the efficiency of people who had done this before or something close enough to it. By the time the ambulance arrived from the Walsenburg station, there were 31 motorcycles idling in the street in front of the county building, arranged in 2 parallel lines facing the direction of the mountain road, their exhaust rising in white columns in the cold air. The paramedics came to May first. She gave them her medication list and her history with the arrhythmia, and described the episode with clinical precision, and answered their questions with the patience of someone who understood that the process was the process, and that the process was what kept people alive. They wanted to take her to the hospital in Pueblo. She said she understood, and that she had one condition. The lead paramedic said, "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I am not telling you how to do your job. I am telling you that the road from here to Pueblo goes through 12 miles of mountain road that has fresh ice from last night, and that the men on those motorcycles know every negotiable route on that road, and that if you want to get me to Pueblo in the time that you need to get me there, you should let them lead you." The paramedic looked at the 31 motorcycles in the street. He looked back at May. He said, "Are they going to stay out of our way?" Ironside appeared at the paramedic's shoulder and said, "We are going to get her there. You follow us." The paramedic made a decision of the kind that is made when the available options have been assessed, and one of them is clearly better than the others regardless of whether it was the expected option. He said, "All right, let's move." They put May on the stretcher and into the ambulance, and Cole got in with her because no one suggested otherwise. And the paramedics looked at him once and then focused on what they were doing. May lay on the stretcher and felt the engine start, and heard through the walls of the ambulance the sound of 31 motorcycle engines shifting from idle to motion. A sound that was somewhere between a rumble and a roar, deep and continuous. The kind of sound that moves through a person rather than past them. The ambulance pulled out, and the motorcycles moved with it ahead of it, and flanking it a corridor of chrome and leather and engine noise moving through the streets of Walsenburg toward the mountain road, while people stopped on the sidewalks and watched with expressions that ranged from confusion to something that had no ready word for it. The mountain road was iced in the places the ambulance driver would have expected, and passable in the ways that only the men riding ahead of it knew from experience the specific angles of approach. On the switchbacks, the places where the shoulder held weight and the places where it did not. The line through the curve at mile 8. That was clear, because the sun hit it in the mornings, in the line that looked clear at mile 11 but was not the alternate route at the junction that added a quarter mile, but avoided the section that had not been sanded. They made it in 37 minutes. Cole's hand was around May's the whole way, not squeezing, just present the way a person holds something they intend to keep. She looked at the ceiling of the ambulance and breathed and let the medication and the paramedics do what they were supposed to do, and she thought about Earl, which was not unusual because she thought about Earl often, but which today had a different quality to it. A sense of report rather than longing, the feeling of having something to tell him. The rhythm in her chest settled at mile 9. By the time they reached the hospital, it was steady and regular, and the monitors confirmed what she could already feel, which was that the episode had passed, and what remained was the manageable baseline she had been living with for 2 years. She was in the hospital for 3 days. Cole and Remy came every afternoon, Ironside came once on the second day and sat for 40 minutes and said almost nothing, and when he left, he put his hand briefly on May's shoulder, which was a gesture she understood to contain more than it appeared to, and which she received accordingly. Grace came on the third day with Wren and sat beside the bed and drew horses in her sketchbook, which was a habit she had developed under Remy's instruction, and which she now maintained with a seriousness that suggested she understood it to be a real activity and not a child's imitation of one. She did not say much. She was 8 years old and she was there, which was the same thing. Wren sat across the room and watched her daughter draw and watched May in the bed, and did not say much either. Before they left, Wren said quietly that Grace's appointment with the specialist in Pueblo was the following week, and that she had spoken to the specialist's office, and they had reviewed Grace's records and were optimistic about the treatment adjustment. May said good. Wren said thank you. May said Earl would be pleased. Boyd Strickland withdrew from the state senate race on the Thursday of that week, citing personal reasons. The withdrawal statement was brief and contained no further explanation. The Colorado Springs law firm sent a letter to May's address the following week, confirming the closure of the complaint file in its entirety and the withdrawal of all associated claims. Sheriff Caffey drove up the mountain on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks after the hearing, when May was back in the cabin and walking her road again in the mornings, and he sat at the kitchen table and had a cup of coffee and did not say much for a while. Then he took a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket and put it on the table. It was a copy of the internal assessment he had filed with the county on the activities at May Whitfield's property, the one he had been required to produce when the formal complaint was submitted. May unfolded it and read it. It was 4 pages precise and fair, and it concluded that the activities at the property constituted emergency medical assistance provided by a trained individual to persons in genuine medical need, that no evidence of unlicensed commercial medical operation had been identified, and that the presence of motorcycle club members at the property was consistent with their status as recipients of said emergency assistance. May read it and folded it and set it on the table. She said, "When did you write this?" Caffey said the week after Agnes Kopp's television interview. May said, "You filed this before the hearing." He said yes. She said, "Why did you not tell me?" He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "Because I thought you might tell me not to. And because I thought it might be more useful if you did not know it was there." May looked at him. She said, "Burl." He said, "I have known you for 12 years, May. I know what Earl built up here. I know what you have been doing since he passed. And I know that when you walked out of that hearing room last November and told me those 2 men were your guests, and you were not turning them over to anyone, I knew what that was. I knew what that cost you." He was quiet. He said, "I should have said something sooner." May considered this. She said, "You said something when it mattered. That is usually enough." He finished his coffee. He put on his hat and shook her hand with both of his and drove back down the mountain. May stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck go and then turned back to the room. The cabin looked the way it always looked in late afternoon, the light coming through the west windows at the angle that caught the dust in the air, and the grain of the floorboards, and the surface of the kitchen table that Earl had built from a single plank of Colorado pine, all of it ordinary and specific, and exactly as it had been for 53 years. On the counter, the blue enamel mug, the percolator, the wooden box, the stack of medical journals. On the table, Earl's compass, which Cole had found in the workshop and brought in without comment, and set there one morning and which May had left where he put it. She looked at the compass for a moment. It was a surveyor's compass. Brass, its case worn smooth at the edges from decades of use. It pointed north the way it had always pointed north, steadily and without drama, the needle finding its direction and holding it regardless of what was happening around it. Earl had kept it because his own father had used it, and because he believed that knowing where you were in relation to fixed things was one of the more underrated skills available to a person. May picked up the compass and held it for a moment and set it back down. She put on her coat and picked up her walking stick and went out onto the porch. February had moved into March while she was in the hospital, and the difference in the light was visible the days longer by a few minutes at each end. The quality of the sun less white and more gold on the peaks to the west. The road below the cabin was still icy in the mornings, but by afternoon the surface softened, and the runoff from the higher elevations had begun to find its way down the slope in the thin braided lines that would eventually become the creeks that filled the valley each spring. She walked to the end of the porch and leaned on the railing and looked out at the mountain. She thought about what had happened since November, not in sequence and not comprehensively, but in the way that a person thinks about things that have been lived through in images and in small, complete moments that carry the weight of the larger thing without requiring a full accounting of it. Two men lying in the frozen grass at the base of an embankment at dawn, the toboggan pulling through the snow, Walt Ironside Dugan bowing his head on this porch in the cold. Cole's voice saying Remy's name in the first hours of his recovery. Grace sitting up straight in her red coat in the hearing room. The sound of 31 engines in the street outside the county building. Cole's hand. She stood on the porch and let the March air come in from the mountains, and she did not feel in that moment particularly old or particularly alone or particularly anything other than present. She felt like a person standing on a porch she had stood on for 53 years, looking at a mountain she had looked at for all of that time, knowing everything she needed to know about what was behind her and what was in front of her, and being on balance satisfied with both. 5 years passed. They passed the way good years pass, with enough difficulty in them to keep a person honest, and enough grace to make the difficulty worth carrying. Cole Greer found his way back to his daughter incrementally, and then completely. The relationship between them rebuilt the way Earl rebuilt broken furniture, carefully joint by joint, testing each one before adding weight. Grace grew. Her lungs improved under the specialist's adjusted protocol. She spent 2 summers at the cabin and learned to identify 15 species of Colorado wildflower and could draw each one from memory. Remy Pruitt enrolled in the Community College Arts program in Pueblo in the spring of that first year and completed his certification 2 years later. He was offered a position teaching art at Pinecrest Elementary, which he accepted with the particular expression of a man who has been offered something he had stopped believing was available to him. He taught Tuesday and Thursday mornings and spent the rest of the week doing the work he had always done, which was looking at things carefully and finding a way to put what he saw on a page. The Earl Whitfield Room opened in the spring of the 5th year in the Pinecrest Community Center on the main street of the town. It was a room of modest dimensions with good windows on the north wall, and a long counter along one side equipped with the kind of basic medical supplies that a community first aid station needed, well organized and properly maintained. The chapter had built out the interior over the course of 6 months, working in groups of 3 or 4 on the weekends, with Cole serving as the general contractor in the way that he served as the general contractor for most things, which was to say he assessed what needed to happen, and he made sure it happened, and he did not require recognition for any particular part of it. The wall across from the windows was the long wall, and the long wall was Remy's. He had been working on it for 8 months, not continuously, but returning to it, adding, revising, standing back from it for days at a time, and then coming back with something he had seen on his morning drive or in his mind in the middle of the night that he needed to add to make it right. It was a mural 7 feet high and 30 feet across, painted in the palette of the San Juan Mountains in winter. The specific cold blue of a morning sky at altitude, the gray and gold of the peaks, the white of the road in the early light. In the center of the mural was a figure standing on a porch. She was not young in the painting, and she was not frail either. She was the specific thing she was, which was a woman in her 80s with a walking stick and a canvas coat, and an expression that contained, if you looked at it long enough, the complete history of a person who had decided long ago how they were going to move through the world and had not wavered from that decision since. Before her in the painting, moving up the road toward the cabin through the snow, was a long line of motorcycles, their chrome catching the light, their riders rendered in enough detail to suggest individual faces without resolving into portraits. The procession moved from the right edge of the mural all the way to the cabin steps, and beyond more than the road could actually hold, more than any road could hold, which was the point. In the lower right corner of the mural, where the road came in from the edge of the frame, Remy had painted a small detail that most people who came into the room over the years noticed eventually, but rarely first: a brass compass lying in the snow at the edge of the road, its needle pointing north, steady and clear. May stood in front of the mural at the opening ceremony and looked at it for a long time. Cole was beside her, and Grace was beside Cole, 17 now, and nearly his height, with her sketchbook under her arm as she moved through the world. Ironside was across the room talking with 2 men from the Pueblo chapter who had driven up for the ceremony. Remy was standing a few feet away from the mural, trying to look like someone who was not watching to see what people thought of it, and failing because that was something he had never been good at concealing. Ren was there. She stood near the back with a cup of coffee and watched her daughter beside Cole, and let herself be satisfied with what she saw, which was a man who had learned how to show up, and a child who knew it. Sheriff Caffey was there. Agnes Kopp was there, standing near the windows with her hands clasped, looking at the mural, with an expression that she would not have been comfortable describing, but that was in fact something in the neighborhood of recognition. May stood in front of the painting and looked at the woman on the porch. She thought about the morning in November 5 years ago, when she had walked out her front door into the cold, with Earl's stick in her hand, not knowing what was on the road ahead, not knowing that the thing she was walking toward was anything other than another morning on a route she had walked 1,000 times. She thought about the toboggan in the snow. She thought about Earl in a ditch in a blizzard in 1957 waiting. She thought about the card in Walt Ironside Dugan's wallet, kept for 37 years. She thought about the compass on the kitchen table pointing north. She did not say any of this out loud. It was not the kind of thing that needed to be said. It was the kind of thing that had already been said in the way that things get said when they are lived rather than spoken. She turned from the mural and found Cole beside her, and nodded to him, and he nodded back. And that was sufficient. The room filled up around them with the sound of people who had come to mark a thing that had happened. And the winter light came through the north windows and lay across the floor in long, pale rectangles. And outside on the main street of Pinecrest, the air was cold and clear, and the San Juan Mountains stood at the western edge of the sky, the way they had always stood, indifferent to the particular year and the particular weather, and the particular collection of people gathered in the room below them. Patient in the way of things that have been in one place long enough to understand that patience is simply what persists. Every year after that, on a morning in late November, an assembly of motorcycles gathers at the bottom of the mountain road that runs up to the ridge above Pinecrest. They come from the Pinecrest chapter. They come from Pueblo and from Alamosa, and from chapters as far as Durango and Grand Junction, drawn by the word that has passed through those networks. The way things pass through tight communities, not announced but understood. They ride up the mountain road in the early morning light slowly, and in formation with the deliberate pace of a procession that is not trying to get anywhere quickly, but is instead engaged in the act of marking something. 2 miles up from the valley floor, there is a section of guardrail that bears a dent from many years ago, still visible if you know to look for it. The road surface here is bare and unremarkable in any season. There is nothing to indicate to a passing motorist that this particular stretch of asphalt is different from any other. The motorcycles slow here and stop. The engines go quiet. Oh, they stay for a few minutes without speaking. The mountains are very still in November. Before the wind comes up, and the sound of the world at 5 in the morning at high altitude is the sound of a place that contains everything. It contains without making any claims about it. Then the engines start again one by one, and the procession continues up the road to the ridge, and the sun comes up behind the eastern peaks, and the light moves across the valley in the way it always does, slowly, and from the top down, filling in the world from the highest places first. Up on the ridge in the cabin Earl built in 1971, with every timber he cut himself, the percolator is already running. The smoke is coming up from the chimney. The blue enamel mug is on the counter. The compass is on the table pointing north.